There we go.
All right.
Okay, so process. If you haven't gotten this impression yet, process is insanely complicated. So I found an interesting video by what looks to be a kind of eccentric professor. And I also found a little lecture that Rabbi Harold Kushner did at the Center for Process Studies. So I think what I'll do is start with Rabbi Kushner, and he kind of what he does is this stuff we call pastoral theology, right? Right. It's sort of how does the minister, the priest, the rabbi talk to the parishioners about these issues. So he comes at the conversation sort of entirely from that point of view. He'll do very little about technical stuff trying to justify it. So the second video is like entirely technical stuff, and that's more related to the kind of material that Griffin's getting at in the book.
Before you start that, who is this guy Whitehead that he refers to all the time?
Okay, Alfred North Whitehead was a contemporary of Einstein's. He was a mathematician and a physicist. He was British. Someone else. Hey, Jenny, I was just explaining who Whitehead was. So Whitehead's physicist and mathematician. In his later life, he took more of an interest in philosophical topics, especially things related to philosophy of science, sort of how should science understand itself. But then he also took an interest in what we call cosmology, or what is ultimate reality like, and where does it come from? And so he wrote this really big book, 500 pages, called Process and Reality, in which he lays out the theory. David Ray Griffin was the principal editor. He edited it with another guy who was a philosopher at Vanderbilt at the time. I think this was like, so 78 was the edition that they edited together. So Whitehead's original edition was published in 1929. So these ideas are 100 years old now.
Mm.
And what Whitehead is doing, I mean, when we get to the second video I'm showing, we'll talk that he'll get into sort of the technical stuff about what Whitehead had in mind and how this is supposed to work. But Griffin was trying to make the book more accessible when he edited it, but which tells you something about what it was like before he got his hands on it. Because he definitely improved it, but it's still this astoundingly impenetrable text. I remember studying this thing in class, and it's just, oh my God. But that's what happens when you get a quantum mechanic physicist decides he wants to write about philosophy. You end up with some really strange stuff going on. So, so the point there is that Whitehead's a very respectable physicist in the world of quantum theory, and so when he talks about anything scientific, he has a lot of gravitas, and since this is sort of the interface of philosophy and science, this view has been influential, and it is kind of interesting. I mean, there are always religious movements to track down in the world somewhere, and people get excited about an idea and they'll come together and people will talk about it for a time, and some of those will last. What's interesting is process seems to mostly be a very intellectual kind of thing. So it's very popular with the kind of people who are professors of theology, but when they're interfacing with the rest of the world, they seem to talk to other people with PhDs. Now, it may be a chemist or a physicist or a biologist, but that seems to be the audience they're attracting. Is they're attracting other very, very highly educated people. So it gets talked about in liberal whoop, we lost someone, gets talked about in liberal seminaries, but again, you're talking about educated people, the seminarians working on master's degrees. So it's interesting that a religious movement that would be situated so deeply among intellectuals is able to perpetuate itself through time. And so the Center for Process Studies it's got to be coming on like 50 years old now. So, they've been doing this stuff for a while, and it does keep building. And there was a time in the 80s and 90s where process was probably the fastest growing school of thought inside liberal theology. And I don't know if that's still true today, but it definitely was true for a number of decades. And I think now what you see, like with the guy that we saw a couple of weeks ago who was talking about the open theology stuff, it's the same. It's the same. Open theology is kind of a generic, and process is a specific. So what seems to have happened is the generic idea of engaging God, a construct of God that is not omnipotent, that generic idea is moving into more mainstream circles, but along the way they're just not keeping up with the details that people like Griffin talk about in terms of what is process theology specifically. But since this is class, we're going to do the complicated version.
Well, thanks for the explanation. I won't rush to check out Whitehead's book from the library, I don't think.
I wouldn't recommend it, at least at this stage. You want some specific interest or some other practice with him. Okay, so let's see here. Let me share the screen and we'll get started with that Rabbi Kushner video. Gotta be here. Who's that? That's the eccentric professor. Okay, here we go. I am starting a little bit in. They did an introduction of him. So this is from 1984, and the book that made him famous, why bad things happen to good people, that was published in 1981. So this is just a couple of years after that was published, and he's at the height of sort of the fame that he had for a while after that book. Well, it was peaking, I guess, at this point is what I want to get at. Okay, so this is him just sort of jumping into his talk.
Delighted that you're here. I hope you can all hear me. If there's anybody who can't hear me, buy my book, because everything I have to say is.
Does have a good sense of humor.
As you've heard, I had tried to get out here to Claremont last year when I was in the area, but my time was not my own. My publisher had arranged for a number of appearances down here, and it was their insistence that I spend my day in Los Angeles talking to Merv Griffin, not David Griffin. I had grown up as a conventionally religious Jew and gone into the rabbinate, believing that everything that happened was God's will, and that if I couldn't understand it, the problem was not with God, it was with me, that I couldn't understand it. Then I got married, and we had a son, and when our son was 3 years old, and we'd been taking him to doctors because he had not been growing and thriving and putting on weight, the doctors told us that he suffered from a very rare disease called progeria, rapid aging. You may remember about 3 years ago, there were those two little boys who went to Disneyland. They had the same illness that our son had died of, progeria. The doctors told us that he would never grow beyond the size of a 3-year-old. He would lose all his hair. He would begin to suffer from the ailments of old age, arthritis and hardening of the arteries and congestive heart failure, when he was still a child, and he would die in his early teens. We simply could not make sense of that news against the background of what I had been taught. And I came to, after much crisis, I came to certain conclusions about God's role in our lives, not as a theologian, not trying to argue logically what is an acceptable concept of God, but as a cruelly hurt parent with overflowing pain and outrage trying to say this could not possibly be God's will. There is, first of all, a long and honorable tradition in Judaism of calling God to account in the name of justice. Abraham, who stands up when God threatens to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and says to God, if there are any innocent people there, you can't do it because you're a God of justice. Job, who says at one point in his book, whatever happens to me, I have to believe that God appreciates my honesty more than he appreciates your flattery.
Mhm.
And other later heroes of Judaism who have said to God, you cannot do that which is less than just and less than fair. I had to come up with some way of believing that God was good, of trying to understand why my son would suffer and die if there was a God in the world, and why other innocent people were suffering and dying, and I, as the rabbi, was ministering to them. I had to try and understand why in what is allegedly God's world, you turn on the news every night and it begins with a story of an accident, a fire, an earthquake. You pick up your newspaper any morning and you find more evidence of murders and robberies and human suffering. My conclusion was, if I am compelled to choose between a powerful God who is not good or a good God who is not powerful, I had to opt for God's goodness as the more religious alternative. I had to believe that a God worthy of worshiping would not want these terrible things to happen, and that perhaps there were forces in the universe which operated independently of God's will. That the idea that God is all-powerful paints us into a theological corner where we have to hold him accountable for every heart attack, every malignant tumor, every fire, every flood, every automobile accident. Perhaps one story summarizes it. I got a letter from a Lutheran minister in rural Nebraska who told me that he had to do a funeral one Sunday for a 26-year-old man who had just died in an automobile crash. The man had been scheduled to be married that same Sunday, in the same church on the same day, almost at the same hour for which his wedding was scheduled. They had to do the funeral, bury him in the church courtyard. The pastor came back to his office and the man's fiancée was waiting for him there. And she said to him, Pastor, if one more person tells me it's God's will, I'm going to scream. Why do they want me to hate God? Because I think that's what we do when we believe that nothing happens in the world unless God wills it. We either teach people to hate themselves for deserving it, or to hate God for giving it to them when they didn't deserve it. I wanted to teach my people, and anyone who would read my book, that God is our friend and not our judge, that these things happen against God's will, and he suffers and grieves with us even as we do, and that he doesn't have some sort of
So here, let me, I'm just, this is 1984, so he's not quite adjusted to the gender neutral language that would be more appropriate in this conversation. So you'll note he's still going to use he.
exalted plan for which makes these things right and desirable. And I've learned in the 2.5 years that the book has been out that there is a great deal of anguish out there in the world, and that the best way to deal with that anguish is to sit with people and hold their hands and persuade them that this is not right, it is not God's will, there is no good reason for it. That in fact, God does love and cherish them and doesn't want them to suffer, and that he is on their side. In the words of the psalmist doesn't say, I look up into the hills, from where does my malignancy come? From where does my disease come? From where does my unemployment come? He says, I look up unto the hills, from where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. It was from this perspective that I came to write about God in a way which I have since discovered is very similar to the seminal work that's being done here in Claremont.
Thank you. I myself find
So this is, they build this as a conversation between Rabbi Kushner and this is John Cobb. And so the editing is a little uneven. So Cobb's occasionally going to just pop in and ask a question, and then Rabbi Kushner will pop in and answer the question.
so convincing the point that the fundamental character of God is goodness and love rather than sheer power and force, that I'm often puzzled that there seems to be so much resistance to that idea. And I know since your work has reached so many people and you've had so many responses that you've become aware also of the kind of resistance to that. Can you reflect some with us about why people don't want to believe that?
Why don't I tell them the story that I told our
Fine.
little committee earlier this afternoon? True story. I had an incident happen a few years ago. I got a notice from my bank that my checking account was overdrawn. And I got very upset because as far as I knew, I had a couple $100 in the account. So I went down to the bank the next morning and I'm ready to pound on somebody's desk and say, what's going on here? Who do you think you're dealing with? I don't write checks if I don't have the money. Do you realize I had to take an hour from a very busy day and come down and straighten this out? Turned out they were right.
What are you going to do?
The mistake was mine. I had entered a deposit twice and had only credited it once. I had a very strange and surprising reaction to that discovery. You know what I felt? I felt relieved. I felt relieved that the bank keeps such accurate records so that I don't have to. And then I could understand why people twist themselves into such emotional and intellectual knots to affirm every kind of rotten, lousy tragedy as God's will. They need to believe that everything is part of a purpose, that somebody is making this happen. The hardest thing for people to accept in my book, I find, is the idea of randomness. Why did this happen? There's no reason for it. It just happened. That's hard for people. People say I could accept any kind of pain if I knew there was a reason for it. I can't accept meaningless pain. People say if I thought that God sent me this sickness to purify me, to punish me, to make me an example for others, whatever the reason, as long as I knew there was a reason, I could take it. To say it's just bad genes, that wipes me out. Part of it, I think, is an element of, I don't want to condemn these people, I just want to disagree with them. I think it's an element of immaturity. People who are not prepared to hear the message that the well-being of the world depends on us. And that I want to say that, you know, we don't write the script. We're just following orders. We're just reading the lines. God pulls the strings. God writes the scripts. That absolves us of responsibility. Part of it, I think, is this tremendous need to know that somebody's driving the bus so we can just relax and sit back and not worry about where it's going. What I say to people today, partly, is that ultimately, we have to forgive God and get over our anger at him for giving us a world, instead of giving us a perfect world, giving us an unpredictable world where the right thing isn't going to happen unless we make it happen. People very much would like to feel that the right thing will happen. It's sort of like, it's a rough analogy, I hope it will do. You go to see a real scary movie and you're not scared because you know somebody is directing the movie and he's going to make everything work out in the end. I think for a lot of people, life is a scary movie. And the only way they can sit there without really losing their popcorn is to assure themselves that God is the director and there's going to be a happy ending to it. And they get very upset if you say to them, you know, even God doesn't know how it's going to end.
It seems to me that when one states it that way, some people are going to say, well, then it sounds like this is just humanism or atheism, and we're just here in this rotten mess and trying to make the best of it. That's not all that you're saying about it, but what is it that God is doing in all of this?
Okay, I'm very glad I have a chance to say that. No, I do not agree with, let's say, Bertrand Russell, that, you know, there is no God, the world is a loose ship and all we can do is, you know, go down with the ship as brave gentlemen. No, I don't believe that. I believe in a God who intervenes in our lives. He doesn't send the problem, he sends us the grace to respond to it. My argument with the insurance companies is what they call acts of God, I think is using the Lord's name in vain. A flood, a fire, an earthquake is not an act of God. It's an act of blind, amoral nature, of a nature which cannot tell the difference between the good people and the bad ones who get in its way. But the efforts of the community to rebuild themselves after the flood or after the earthquake, that's the act of God. God, I think, does three things. First, he has given us a world which is predictable, which basically runs by laws. I was speaking at a synagogue in Newport Beach last night, and a young man who is an Orthodox Jew came up to me and said afterwards, why can't an all-powerful God suspend the laws of nature if they're going to hurt an innocent person? So I said to him, can an all-powerful God make a four-sided triangle? No, of course not. All right, can an all-powerful God create a universal law and make it apply sometimes and not other times. And he didn't quite understand the question, but I said, no, this is a contradiction in terms. If laws of nature, it may be very cruel that laws of nature make innocent people suffer. But how livable would the world be if laws of nature sometimes applied and sometimes didn't apply? If I have to get on a plane back to Boston tomorrow, and I don't know if the plane will fly safely, or if the laws of astrophysics will stop operating because there are a whole bunch of mafia chieftains on the plane and God wants it to crash, who can live like this? If I don't understand why one person, let's say, gets cancer and another doesn't, I have to affirm that there are reasons, even if I don't know the reasons. And I sometimes think when we care enough to spend as much money on cancer research as we spend on cigarettes and cosmetics to make us sick, when we care enough to pay medical researchers what we pay quarterbacks and left fielders in this country, maybe somebody come up with a reason. Basically, I've got to believe there are rules, and God has given us an orderly world that makes sense. More importantly, I sometimes think the best line in my book is a line I didn't write. It's a quotation from a 19th century Hasidic rabbi who said, human beings are God's language. That is, what people, when people are hurt and cry out to God, God responds not by talking to them in Hebrew, Latin, or English, depending on your religious preference. God responds by coming to us in the incarnation of good people. There's a story I love to tell about the little boy whose mother sends him on an errand, and it takes him a long time to get back. When he finally gets back, his mother says, "Where were you? I was worried about you." Boy answers, "Oh, there's a kid down the street whose tricycle broke and he was crying because he couldn't fix it. And I felt bad, so I stopped to help him." Mother says, "You know how to fix a tricycle?" Boy says, "No, of course not. I sat and I helped him cry."
Compassion.
Did you have a question?
No, that's compassion.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I've learned? Why me? Why is God doing this to me? Is not a question. It's not a question. It is a cry of pain. And you respond to the person who says, "Why me?" not by answering her question, but by assuaging her pain. Think of it. Your best friend says to you, "What did I ever do to deserve this?" Does he want you to give him a list of things he did to deserve this? He wants you to tell him that he doesn't deserve this, that he's a good person and what is happening to him is unfair. My aphorism, suffering people need not explanation, but consolation. You don't help them by explaining why it's right that they're suffering. You help them by holding their hands. I remember when I was a young, naive rabbi, I would go into a house where there had been a tragedy, and people would say to me, "Rabbi, why would God let this happen to such a good person?" And I thought they were asking me a question about God. And that's fine, because I know about that. I took courses in it. And I would offer them a 15-minute summary of my senior theology course in rabbinic school. And when I was done and their eyes had sort of glazed over, I would say to them, "Now, I know this is a little bit technical. Maybe you didn't get it the first time. Would you like me to repeat it?" And they would say, "Rabbi, please, we've suffered enough." I've learned. And what I do now is I don't explain God. I say, "I'm sorry." And I hold people's hands and I listen to them. Because they don't want explanations. They want consolation. They want to know that they are worth caring about. One of the things God manifests himself in is the capacity of people, despite their squeamishness. It's no fun to go see your friend suffering, to reach out and be a good friend and neighbor. And one of the things that God does, I think, is to give us the capacity to transcend ourselves. I think I still believe in God because I am always seeing ordinary people do extraordinary things. I am seeing people come up with qualities of soul that they would be the first ones to tell you they didn't have last week. True story. It was June of 1981. I announced to my family that my goal for that summer was to get into shape to run the Falmouth Road Race. I don't know if anybody here has ever been on Cape Cod, but every August there's a 7-mile mini marathon. Big deal in Falmouth. Everybody goes down there. Everybody has to choose between participating in the race or watching it. I'm lucky. The way I run, I do both. Anyhow, to encourage my efforts to run 7 miles, my daughter got me a t-shirt to wear when I run. And on the back of this t-shirt, she imprinted Isaiah 40:31, which you will recall reads, "Those who trust in the Lord will have their strength renewed. They shall run and not grow weary." It didn't help me when I ran, but it's been very important to me ever since. I find God in the midst of human tragedy, not as the author of the tragedy for some obscure purpose which we can't comprehend, but as the source of the astonishing capacity of the human soul to survive a tragedy. And by the way, that's what you do with tragedy. You don't explain it, you don't justify it, you survive it. God manifests himself not by sending us illness, but by giving us more strength, more love, more courage than we ever thought we were capable of having. And when we used up all the patience and all the strength we start with, we turn to God and he gives us more. Now, when I say that God is not all powerful, I don't mean to teach that God is an innocent bystander watching what happens to us in this world. I believe in a God who stands for goodness and helpfulness. He does not send the problem. He sends the grace to deal with the problem. When an airplane crashes in Washington, D.C. and hits the 16th Street Bridge, that's not God's will, that's physics. But when Lenny Skutnik happens to be walking by, and without understanding what he's doing, for the first time in his life, becomes a hero, jumps into the river to save the stewardess, that, I believe, is God in action.
When we think of God that way, it does leave us with profound uncertainties about the future.
Yes.
And these days, many of us have enormous anxiety about the future. That is, we know that we have weapons with which we can not only destroy our enemy and ourselves, but the whole of humanity. Could you comment how you see the relationship of what you're saying to that?
John, that's very interesting. Excuse me. I was in Europe right after that Sunday in October when the people came out and marched against the Pershing missiles. My book was translated into German and Danish, and I went over to do some publicity and promotional work for the book. I was lecturing in Denmark to the public lecture to the Jewish community of Copenhagen that week. It happened to be a very bad night to lecture. That same night, the Danish national soccer team was on television in the semifinals of the European Cup. Right after I finished my lecture, the chief rabbi of Denmark, who was introducing me, made the announcement that the Danish team had just lost 1-0 and that they'd be selling a lot of copies of my book tomorrow. The first question after my lecture was a question I had never been asked in the United States. Somebody asked about what are the implications of your theology for the prospects of nuclear war? Does your view of God have anything to teach us? I didn't know for a second. I was kind of taken aback. Nobody had ever asked me that before. And I thought about it. And I said, the only connection I can find is this. You cannot depend on God to pull us back from the brink. If God has given us freedom, if God has permitted us to evolve as unique creatures with the sense of moral responsibility that we have, that gift of freedom is irrevocable. If we're going to do something bad, whether it's robbing a local bank or detonating a nuclear bomb, we are going to be free to do it. If human beings were not going to stop Hitler in the 1930s, God was not going to stop him. The world would have been a lot pleasanter and less messy had God struck Hitler down with a heart attack or an automobile accident in 1935. He didn't. Not that he chose not to. The rules of the game were that God does not intervene in our lives. And if people are going to be crazy enough to contemplate a nuclear encounter in which not only will we die, but all the future generations of mankind will not be born, you cannot count on God to save us from the results of our own folly. That's what I said. When I finished, the chief rabbi of Denmark got up and said that, with all due respect to our guest speaker, he has faith that God will not let this happen. And whatever else happens, he cannot believe that God would let a nuclear war wipe out mankind. He has to believe that God loves this world sufficiently to save us from our own foolishness. And while I was not about to argue with him, That response worried me very much. I'm afraid there is a part of us that is prepared to believe that. You know, it's kind of like the life is a horror movie image. There's a part of us that says this is so unbearable, God would not let it happen. And I'm sorry to say there is no evidence in all of human history that I'm aware of that God will intervene and save us from the consequences of our own foolishness. Perhaps he will in this way. God will not stop us from doing something. God will manifest himself in good, dedicated, reasonable people who will try and awaken us to the consequences of our folly. But if we will not listen to the voice of God within us, I cannot rest confident that God will pull us back from the brink. I wish that were not my answer, but I think if this is in fact the truth, we had better tell people that this is the truth so we don't misplace our trust.
There's a terribly difficult line, isn't there, that to deceive ourselves into thinking that everything will be all right because we believe in God and God would not let us do that, leads us to a kind of complacency. And then if we say, no, that's not the case, it depends upon what we do, that may lead a great many people into despair. And it seems to me that despair and complacency have a very similar result. That is, both
Alas, yes. Yeah.
seem to leave us inactive.
Try this, John, as a middle ground between those two very undesirable ends. God will not save us from the results of our own foolishness, but God will give us everything we need to save ourselves. God will not withhold from his creatures the wisdom and the perseverance to make the right decision. Whether we will have the tools, whether we use those tools to save ourselves and future generations from distinction is up to us. The very least that God does for us is say to us, a happy ending is not impossible. Life is not a tease. Life has within it the possibility for humane, decent living. The tools are all there. All we have to do is realize it and use it because we have come to depend on ourselves.
The things you mentioned and passed over rather quickly with respect to how God deals with us in our suffering is that God suffers with us in our suffering. And that's an idea that's very important to me. I wonder if you could tell us about where that idea has come from in your own reflection.
It's interesting. I have gotten some reactions from Jewish readers of my book who were uncomfortable with the image of God's suffering. They seem to think it's a Christian image and not a Jewish one. No, it's certainly a very Christian image, and it is played down in Judaism. But I think it has roots in Judaism. There are legends about God weeping when he sees what people do to each other, God going into exile with his people when the temple is destroyed. My teacher, Professor Abraham Heschel, wrote a book-length treatment of the prophets, where he characterizes the prophets as people who could see the world from God's point of view and who could feel God's pain at the injustice and the suffering that goes on in this world. But more than anything else, this was not the source of my imagery of God's suffering. It was just supportive texts. The image, I think, is that I had to affirm God's goodness, God's decency, God's justice, God's compassion. And anything which could not be reconciled with that, I could not attribute to God. If we suffer vicariously, empathically with people who are suffering, I can only believe that this is God's pathos reflecting itself in us. It's not that we are being anthropomorphic about God, as my teacher Abraham Heschel used to say. We're not being anthropomorphic and describing God in human terms. To talk about people being righteously indignant when they read about injustice, to talk about people being compassionate when they see suffering, is to be theomorphic about man. Not to describe God in human terms, but to describe men in divine terms. To respond to suffering with compassion is not to make God human, but to make human beings divine. I had to affirm that our own capacity for pathos is a reflection of the supreme pathos, the supreme anger in the face of unfairness, the supreme compassion in the face of pain, which originates in God and reflects itself in us.
You brought up the fact that on this particular point, some Jews said that was a dangerous idea for Jews. It sounded too Christian. I certainly agree with you that it is both Jewish and Christian and not something in between. Were there any other respects in which you felt that you got a different kind of response from Jewish readers and from Christian readers?
Surprisingly, very little. What really astonished me about this is, I'll tell you, I wrote a book 3-4 years ago, which I thought a few thousand Jews and a few relatives of mine would read, and not beyond that. I never expected it to be received in the Christian community the way it was. One of the things I want to say, by the way, is that it is the Protestant clergy who made my book a bestseller. They did it. They picked it up, they gave sermons about it, and the word of mouth began to spread. They would hand copies of the book to people who had had a loss, people in hospitals, and it was essentially through their work that the book spread beyond a very small circle of personal friends of mine and became a national phenomenon. I get a few letters from Christians who assume that because I'm a rabbi, I've never heard of the New Testament, and that if I would just read it with an open mind, I would rewrite my book in a more correct perspective. But I also get letters from Orthodox Jews who suggest that instead of giving so many speeches, I should go back and read the book of Isaiah, with which I'm obviously unfamiliar. No, what really struck me is that so many people of so many different religious persuasions were open to the message of the book. They wanted to be comforted by the idea that God is on their side and that God is good and that God is there to enhance their sense of personal worth. There were virtually no differences between Jews and Christians. There were elements in both communities of a fundamentalist nature who could not accept my book because they thought I was diminishing God. I will insist that I am not diminishing God, that I am in fact adding to God's greatness when I identify his power as the power to sustain and the power to rebuild rather than the power to control. David Griffin has already taught me something very important today. This one insight alone made my trip out here to Claremont worthwhile, that we need not define power as coercive power. It can be a persuasive power. It can be liberating power. It can be the power to turn somebody's energy loose rather than the power to pull his strings. And that's a kind of power that God has perhaps an unlimited quantity.
We hope you have found this interview helpful.
That's Griffin in 1984. He looks so young. Okay, any thoughts at this point? He's very charming. I do love listening to him.
Yeah, he's
Well,
good.
So, I mean, I know this didn't come up at the time, but since that book or since process theory, is there any response in the Muslim world?
I am told that yeah, there are conversations and there are liberal imams who are part of this conversation. That's a harder world for me to get into, I guess. There's other things I'd have to study to really understand it.
Well, then how does an atheist explain the suffering of man?
What do you mean?
Well, why do we suffer in an atheist world? If you don't believe in something outside, you just accept that you suffer.
That's just a world, world of, that's the world we live in.
Yeah, we're just muddling through and it's just the best we can do. And that's, muddle. But what was he referring to? Oh gosh, now I blanked out. The philosopher,
Bertrand Russell.
yes, thank you. Didn't he refer to Russell as the muddle view?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It just is. It is. And so it's entirely up to people how people live.
Mm-hmm.
But which is interesting. I mean, which is something the process has in common with atheist thought, is that how people actually end up faring in the world is entirely up to what people do.
Mhm.
So yeah.
It seems like Kushner leaves out that whole part that is in the Griffin article about creation in the beginning, whether it's from nothing or from chaos.
Chaos.
He just says that's how we wind up being.
Yeah, he doesn't, I mean, in his own work, he doesn't do the technical stuff. Yeah. Which is, I think, in some ways makes the job a little easier for pastoral theologians. But the work they do is harder because they're
Right.
the ones trying to do the soothing with people, which is hard work. Noble work, but hard work.
You know, I'm taking this class in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
And my quibble or whatever is that the Old Testament God is very furious. He's not at all happy with his creations. And then he rewards people with wonderful stuff. He's very materialistic.
Yeah.
So is that also a process then, because we have come to see the God not as that, because there is no justice in that? Because what is there for justice in there if you just reward people who do what you want to do and you have the power?
Yeah, and I think people, well, the culture has moved around a lot on this kind of thinking, right? Because there's very definitely a way of thinking about the world that gets very entrenched in feudal society, that what's right and wrong is what you're told is right or wrong. That, you know, if the king says it's right, then it's right. Or if the bishop says God said it's right, then that's what's right. So that it's called a command theory in ethics. That so from that point of view, you've sort of suspended any sense of an objective or personally derived
Independent thought.
right or wrong.
Mhm.
You're entirely relying on what does the authority tell you. So the biblical text reflects some of that point of view, that, well, it's right because God said so.
Mhm.
Doing it if God said it, then that's what's right. But as you know, Kushner's also talking about, there's this other tradition where people protest against what God is saying and saying, well, no, wait a second, you're supposed to be just. And so sort of calling God to be more consistent in that way, in terms of God's own sense of justice. So which is implying that the human being is relying on their own internal reflections to derive a sense of justice, which is now agreeing with what they thought God was supposed to do. And now when God isn't doing it, then you can challenge God to do what you thought God was supposed to do, because you thought you agreed with God before, and now you discover God's doing something wrong. So there are those different perspectives all mixed in with each other, depending on which book you're reading. And
Just one quick comment. I think I knew at some point before, but I'd forgotten that Kushner had this child that died of this progeria, which is really very, very tragic kind of situation. And I am amazed, thinking about it, that he could still maintain that belief in the event really fostering his own growth and compassion and goodness and so on. I mean, I remember we had a neighbor who lost a daughter at around age 10 due to bone cancer. She was a very observant Christian before that, and she cut it off just straight. She could not cross that hurdle between watching helplessly as her daughter was in great pain at the end and died. And so it's amazing that that this man can be that persuasive with his thoughts, you know, given the experience that he had.
Yeah, indeed, it is remarkable that way. And clearly it did cause a crisis for him. He just finds a different solution to the crisis. And it's also because he's part of a liberal religious tradition. He's not in a conservative religious tradition,
Right.
which I think it makes it much harder on people to make that turn. For liberal religion, it's kind of out, it's in the air somehow, and it's there to make that turn if you choose to make it. But it's still that's a big deal for someone to confront, that this thing and he, as a rabbi, right, he'd been trained and he'd gone through all of this, and he'd spent years and years thinking about what he thought about God, and now he's confronting something that he can't put together anymore. And
Yeah.
so I take it as a sign of genius that what he reasons to is what this view we call open theology generally, or something like process, that he just figured out that makes sense to me. And so he ends up with this position that they've been developing already. So it really does seem like it was as he described it, that he writes the book and then discovers, oh,
Well,
that's process theology, isn't it? What do you know? He made it up on his own for himself, but that was the school he stumbled into all on his own. I think it's kind of.
I remember giving that book to my daughter when she was in her 20s, and I am a humanist. I do find a lot of humanism in his thinking. You are responsible for what you do.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really need a God for that. You're responsible. You know what's good and bad. You don't hurt people. Be kind.
Yeah, no, I think what he wants to emphasize is sort of is people finding the strength to do sort of extraordinary things, and then he'll call that God.
So is he the one who's responsible for that God not driving the bus analogy, or did that come from someone else?
I don't. I think that's something from somewhere else.
Somebody else. Okay.
Because that sounds like someone more trying to do the more technical version with a useful analogy. Because he does technical stuff that doesn't seem quite like his wheelhouse.
Okay.
All right. Well, on technical stuff. So the video I found, I'm impressed with the content, but I am deeply puzzled by the costume that this guy is wearing. And I'm just, for the sake of time, I am trying to skip the introduction where he explains why, but it has to do something with the series of videos that this one video is a part of. And there's some sort of joke that we're not quite clued in on because we're not watching the whole series. But anyway, so he's going to look a little kind of what I think is a little goofy for a philosophy professor trying to do something serious. But what he does is very technically coherent and accurate. So what is that doing there? Oh, make that get smaller. There we go. Okay.
I'm going to discuss theodicy in light of process theology. Now, let's take a few seconds to situate ourselves.
Uh-oh. Now it's going to make us
Wait ourselves here.
Okay.
Up to this point, all the different theodicies that we've discussed have really had some alignment with the notion of classical theism. They all maintained that God was omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and perfectly good. In other cases, God is still viewed with these attributes, but God chooses to set them aside for the sake of a genuine relationship with the world. With process theology, we're engaging in a fundamental worldview shift. So it makes sense that we're going to have to explore that worldview a little bit before we get into the actual theodicy. Some of this is going to be a bit complicated, so do your best to stick with me. After we give a basic introduction to process theology, we'll explore again the idea of God and the idea of evil. Then we're going to chart at least one form of process theodicy in light of our categorizing questions with regard to God's responsibility and God's power or ability to prevent evil. After that, we'll explore our diagnostic questions, and finally, we'll end with a brief critical overview of process theodicy. Let us get started. I don't care, Carl. It's fun, and I enjoy it. You're a stupid costume. Process philosophy developed out of the thought of the 20th century English philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, as well as the American philosopher, also from the 20th century, Charles Hartshorne. Now, to be clear, there's many different variations of process thought, which lead, of course, to many different theodicies within process thought, just as there are many different theodicies in open theism and classical theism, so on and so forth. Our goal here is to focus on the thought of two prominent contemporary process theologians, David Ray Griffin and John Cobb. While there is a lot of variation within process thought, Cobb and Griffin identify some key basic ideas that are pretty consistent across the board. Let's explore these now. First and foremost, process is essential to existence. Everything is in process. Everything, including God. Second, process entails that existence is comprised of a series of events that we call occasions. This is a little different than we tend to think about reality. The basic idea is that every moment of time, things spring into existence and then spring out of existence. This is also true of me. That is, the me of the past is not the exact same as the me of the present, nor is the me of the present the exact same of the me of the future. Each me of each moment is a unique entity that arises into existence and then fades out of existence. And this is true of all entities, whether it be human beings, atoms, quarks, trees, bears, anything. We might then ask, well, how does something persist over time? To answer this
Right.
question.
So remember, this is the guy who did quantum theory in physics. This is why the theory has this kind of detail in it.
Cobb and Griffin note that certain theories of events have a lot in common. In fact, they have so much in common that we can identify some sameness between event to event. These essentially similar series of events create what Cobb and Griffin call streams of occasions. And you're looking at one right now. I am a stream of occasions. The idea is that the me in the present is so intricately and essentially related to the me's of the past that we are, in some sense, the same. Furthermore, the me of the present is informed by the me's of the past. This happens in two ways. One, the me's of the past create, in some sense, the atmosphere in which the me in the present comes into existence. And two, the me of the present shares the memories of the me's of the past, such that all of those me's of the past are gathered into this one moment. And this moment, this me that exists right now, will give way to the me of the future. And this I that exists in this moment, will become a memory for the me of the future. I know that's all really complicated, but the basic idea that I want to share is everything is in process, and process entails things coming into existence and going out of existence, even if they create a stream of occasions. So when I say actual occasions or streams of occasions, that's what I'm referring to in this video. If that's still a little bit confusing, it might be helpful to think of an analogy here. Consider a flip book. In this analogy, each page of the flip book is an actual occasion, that is, a me that exists. Each page is individual and separate from every other page. The idea here is that pages only exist when they come into motion. When you're using the flip book, you're turning it and the pages are flipping. However, some pages are stationary. The pages that have already been flipped are stationary, and the pages that have not yet been flipped are stationary. In this sense, they don't exist, since existence in this analogy is equated with movement. The only entities that actually exist are the pages that are in movement. So here's how a flip book works. One page moves rapidly across your vision, then another page moves rapidly across your vision. Each page that comes into being moves briefly, has a moment of process, and then gives way to another page. However, if you're looking at the flip book, there is the appearance of a stream of occasions, that is a coherent narrative that seems to move as if it were one single entity. The problem with this analogy, as we're going to see, is that it suggests that the future is set or determined. After all, a flip book can only happen the way that it's drawn or the way that it's written. Although a few friends of mine have suggested the possibility of a choose-your-own-adventure flip book, which might work. Setting that aside, it's important to note that for process theology, the future is not determined. It can happen in many, many different ways. We'll get to that. Third, all occasions have subjectivity. It's important that we not mistake subjectivity with consciousness, but merely the ability to experience your own existence. And when process theologians say that all events have subjectivity, they really mean that. Not just humans, but non-human animals, plants, even non-living matter like rocks have a certain level of subjectivity. We should note that there are various degrees to the richness of this subjectivity, the richness of these experiences. Certainly a rock doesn't experience things as richly as a human being. Still, the notion is that there is subjectivity in the entire cosmos for every entity that exists. Fourth, the goal of all occasions is to experience what process philosophers refer to as enjoyment. Enjoyment means that occasions experience their existence, their moment of being, in a manner that is conducive to their nature and permits flourishing according to that nature. This flourishing is a balance between harmony with all the world around me, including other entities that are trying to enjoy their existence, and intensity, which means the depth to which I experience my own existence in the moment that I exist. Fifth, all reality is interconnected. We can say this in two ways. First, all reality is interconnected because the me that exists right now is essentially interconnected and related to all the me's of the past. In this sense, whatever entity comes into existence owes its being in some sense to the entities that preceded it. Furthermore, the way that individual entities experience their existence is heavily influenced by the entities of the past. Another way that we are interconnected and interdependent is that every entity is essentially related to all other entities that exist alongside of it. And all of those entities, of course, are also influenced by the entities of the past. In this sense, every entity everywhere is influenced in a way by all other entities. Everything is interconnected and related. And this is the essential nature of existence. Everything experiences existence this way, as we'll note, even God. Sixth, all occasions have a degree of self-determination. And again, this is where the flip book analogy breaks down. To say that all entities have a degree of self-determination is to say that when an entity springs into existence, it is influenced by all entities around it, and it is influenced by the entities of the past. However, within the moment of its existence, it can choose how to create and shape the future. It can bring about newness by determining its own path, at least to a certain extent. This means that the me of the present, while influenced by the me's of the past and all the other entities around me, has some say in what comes next, some notion of free will, some ability to determine the future, what the me of the future will experience when it comes into reality. Again, all creatures, whether human or not, even living or not, have some degree of self-determination, but they do vary in degrees. A human with its high level of complexity and mental consciousness has a lot more self-determination than, say, a rock. But all creatures can respond to the influences that impact them. It follows that the future is not determined. It is open depending on the self-determination of each entity that exists in every moment. This leads to the seventh point. The future is in fact open, and it's even open for God. When each entity chooses its path by way of its degree of self-determination, it engages in an act of creation in which it participates in the creation of the future. In other words, the future that comes into existence is going to be dependent upon the decisions that all entities actually make, the self-determining actions that they put into motion. It's also important to note that in this framework, the future actually doesn't exist until it becomes the present. Because the future doesn't yet exist, and because the future is determined by the free actions, free decisions of all entities in existence, the future is essentially unknowable, not only to us humans, but also to God. With these thoughts in place, we can begin to understand how process thought will construe God. Let's take a look at a few key concepts. First,
now here I guess it might help to know that some context that if you combine omnipotence and omniscience, one of the consequences tends to be that would entail that God knows all time. And there is, of course, along the way, other constructions that would just sort of argue, well, God is in fact out of time, that time is something we experience. So from that line of thought, God knows all of our history already. So in what sense are we actually free if God knows already all of history? So for the process people, they're arguing with a line of Protestant theology, especially out of Calvin, that wants to emphasize that bit with, Calvin has this idea about double predestination that he called it. But what Calvin's doing in all of that is really just following the logical implications of the construct that God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, and God is outside of time. Therefore, all of time must already be determined. So process is a radical pushback on that idea, saying, no, the future is radically open, in fact. So no one knows what's going to happen. So it's an important point, and therefore it gets emphasized in this way.
Process theologians tend to affirm what they call dipolar theism. Essentially, this means that there are two poles in God. One pole is eternal and unchanging, but this pole refers to God's abstract characteristics. For example, God is love. That doesn't change. God is always love. God is in fact omniscient. That doesn't change. God is always omniscient. However, omniscient here means knowing everything that can be known. The other pole of God's existence is constantly in process and constantly changing. This is God's actual experience of reality. God as God exists in relation to everything else that exists. And in this pole of God's nature, God is responsive and therefore changing. For example, God is constantly love, but exactly how God exercises that love will depend upon how other creatures act. Therefore, God's love is always in process in responding to other creatures. God is all-knowing. This doesn't change. But again, God knows everything that can be known. Because the future can be known, as the future becomes the present, God is constantly learning more. In other words, what can be known continues to grow and develop. So God's knowledge also continues to grow and develop. So in one sense, God is unchanging. That is, God is love, God is omniscient, God is responsive. But in another sense, God is constantly in process. God is always loving in new ways in response to creaturely existence. God is always learning new things as the future becomes the present. It follows from this that God's essential existence is characterized by process and change. In other words, unlike other forms of theodicy that rely upon the idea of voluntary kenosis, where God chooses to be related to other creatures, in process theology, God is essentially related, not because God chooses to be, but because that's just the way reality is. And even God is bound to that reality. Second, Cobb and Griffin, along with many other process theologians, reject the idea that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. For Cobb and Griffin, God creates the world out of a pre-existing and co-eternal chaos that has existed alongside God from the beginning. Of course, there is no such thing as the beginning in eternity, but you get the idea. This chaos is envisioned as a somewhat vacuous existence in which entities spring into being, but immediately spring out of being. And there are no streams of occasion. There's no potential. There's no moment of intense enjoyment that's possible in this kind of world. And so God decides to lure this world toward a particular order in which these kinds of more intense experiences of enjoyment are possible. And this, according to process theologians like Cobb and Griffin, is the divine act of creation. Third, God cannot act coercively upon the world, and God cannot know the future exhaustively. Because on the one hand, God is love, and on the other hand, God is incorporeal, God cannot physically act on the world and coercively bring about certain changes that God wants to bring about. One of the fundamental themes of process theology is love does not coerce. Love might lure, love might guide, but love does not force. Therefore, God does not force God's will upon the world.
And here it's worth noting that if you really push on any kind of theology, and you want to ask, well, how does God interact with the world? What is the mechanism by which God would do something? Say, talk to someone in the way God talks to a prophet, or making a boulder move from one place to another. You know, how does that? What you're left with is, well, it's just magic. There's this power, I don't know, God snaps God's fingers, things happen. It's magic. But because of the emphasis in deep physics from Whitehead, process here has an actual physical mechanism they're describing by which they understand God to interact with the world. Now, it's not something we can test because the mechanism exists on a scale the size of which is, smaller than subatomic particles, smaller than quarks. So it's tiny, 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 tiny mechanisms. So too tiny for us to test with our current technology. But he's actually describing something that in physics terms is kind of a coherent story that has actual mechanisms of action and how things work. And you can describe it in a way that is theoretically testable if you had a better technology to test it. So it even on this level, the scientific emphasis that Whitehead has in his, in his personality, you see that coming through in this kind of thinking too.
The act of creation then is not God deciding this is how the world is going to be. It's a slow and long process of God luring chaos toward an order that can facilitate intense levels of enjoyment. In other words, God lures the world toward an order in which streams of occasions are possible, and not just any streams of occasions, but complex streams of occasions. Even the idea of conscious streams of occasion, for example, some higher mammals and humans. All of this is at the service of God intensifying enjoyment and creativity in the created order. But recall that each of these entities has a level of self-determination. It follows that the world that God creates is not completely up to God. These creatures co-create the future with God. While God is one influence, one non-coercive influence upon the world, God is not the only influence. Other creatures also influence the world. It follows that the future isn't necessarily exactly what God wants it to be. And again, recall, these creatures don't have self-determination because God chose to set aside God's omnipotence. They have self-determination because that is the very nature of existence. God cannot choose to create a world where God can control everything. And so when God does create, God is bound to certain principles of existence. One such principle is the idea that the capacity for good and the capacity for evil are proportional and linked together. God cannot create a world with the capacity for good that doesn't also have the capacity for evil. For example, the capacity of pleasure corresponds to the capacity for pain. The capacity for enjoyment corresponds to the capacity of disappointment or triviality. God cannot create the world any other way than this. In short, it would be impossible for God to lure a world into existence that had the capacity for good without risking the reality of evil. That doesn't mean that God is completely hands-off in the world. While God cannot control the future, God does work within each individual occasion, that is, each individual entity. God provides each entity with what process theologians call an initial aim. That is, God provides each entity with a direction, not coercively, but by way of lure or guidance. And that initial aim is the maximal enjoyment of that entity. That's what God wants, all these actual occasions to enjoy their existence. However, because these actual occasions have self-determination, they do not have to conform to the initial aim that God provides them. They create their own subjective aim, what they actually do. Oftentimes, these entities can act in ways that does not cohere with God's desire for the world, God's initial aim. And therefore, the future happens in a way that's other than how God actually willed it to happen. It follows also that God experiences the future with creatures, alongside of creatures. God can be surprised by it, disappointed by it. What happens next is not up to God. God is not in control in that sense, and God could not be in control in that sense. God is bound relationally to other creatures, and together, God and creatures create the future. Fourth, God is present everywhere in the world. We've already noted that God is present in all actual occasions, providing them by way of lure some initial aim that God desires for them. God is everywhere at all times. God is completely immanent.
He really should say universe, not world. God is everywhere in the universe.
In the created order. It follows from this that when God takes the risk of creating, God is also risking God's own well-being, because God experiences all the joys and all the harms of the world. Every good thing and every bad thing that happens, God experiences alongside of creatures. I trust that it's clear that this concept of God is fairly different than many of the concepts that we've discussed up to this point. So what about the concept of evil? What does that look like for process theologians? Cobb and Griffin follow Whitehead in identifying two fundamental types of evil. The first type of evil is discord, which entails physical pain and mental suffering, the basic harms that we tend to think about when we think about the problem of evil. However, there's another kind of evil that's also important, and that is triviality. Now, discord is intrinsically evil. Anywhere harms happen, whether physical pain or mental anguish, that's evil, that's bad. Triviality is a little bit different. Triviality refers to creatures not experiencing enjoyment to the extent that they could experience enjoyment. There are some forms of triviality that are unnecessary when the experience of creatures is so banal that there's hardly any enjoyment at all. This kind of triviality is evil. In other words, it's evil when creatures don't experience enjoyment, when either they're robbed of that enjoyment or they don't choose to live up to the potential of their enjoyment. Cobb and Griffin note
This gives them, the theology gives it a lot of power to confront something like poverty and say, oh, poverty is evil. and therefore it must be resisted. And the reason they'll bring that out is because of this triviality idea. So it's for kind of liberal thought, liberal social thought, that's another reason I think process becomes popular, is that it introduces a language in which the religious ideas are really firmly rooted in human compassion and suggesting very much political programs of equality as a way of achieving that kind of thing.
That the problem of evil tends to focus on discord as evil, not necessarily triviality, but they want to emphasize triviality because it suggests that God is actually combating two different kinds of evil. On the one hand, there's physical pain and there's mental anguish, but on the other hand, there's this notion that lack of enjoyment is also bad. On the one hand, God has to diminish discord, but on the other hand, God has to overcome triviality. And as we'll find, at times, God can't do both simultaneously. It may be that God has to lure the world toward discord in order to overcome triviality. Before moving on, it's important to note that Griffin adds a unique idea to this conversation. Griffin discusses the idea of genuine evil, which he contrasts to, on the one hand, apparent evil, and on the other hand, prima facie evil. Griffin defines a genuine evil as anything, all things considered, without which the world would have been better. So genuine evil isn't really measured by the experience of individuals, but by the experience of all entities in the cosmos as a whole. Again, the whole outweighs the experience of the individual or the part. Prima facie evil is evil that at first glance looks evil. However, it's possible that our initial evaluation of evil is wrong. Why? Well, because evil can either be intrinsic or instrumental. Also, good can be either intrinsic or instrumental. We discovered this already with the theodicies of Hick and Polkinghorne, that evil plays either some necessary role in achieving some good, or evil is the inevitable outcome of a process that is necessary to achieve a particular goal. Either way, evil has some kind of instrumentalism to it. And the idea is that if the good the evil produces outweighs the evil itself, well, then it's not a genuine evil, because the world is better on the whole, even though that evil happened. And because that evil happened. Evils that are not genuine evils then are apparent evils. That is, evils that appear evil to us, but in the grand scheme of things are actually justified because the good that they produce outweighs the bad. Genuine evil in this sense is kind of similar to the notion of gratuitous evil. Cobb and Griffin both accept that genuine evil actually exists, and in their minds it's this type of evil that theodicies have to really wrestle with. All right, having now provided a rather strenuous overview of process theology, including the view of God and evil, let's look at our two categorizing questions. First, is God responsible for evil? Cobb and Griffin both say yes. God is responsible for evil. God is responsible for evil because God lures the world into an order in which certain harms, certain discord is inevitable and maybe even necessary. For example, without the extinction of dinosaurs, you don't have the high level of complexity of mammals such as humans. But also God lures the world into an order in which genuine evil is possible. That is, it's a risk. So on the one hand, discord is inevitable and certain forms of triviality are inevitable, but also genuine evil, evil that is so bad that the world would have been better if it had not happened, that is also a possibility, though not an inevitability. However, Cobb and Griffin both maintain that God is not indictable for luring the world in this direction. There are two reasons for this. First, the reason that God lures the world to this particular order is because that's the only way to overcome triviality, by creating complex and intense levels of subjectivity and self-determination. For example, human consciousness. Because triviality can be evil and overcoming triviality is important, this good outweighs all the discord that is inevitable as a result of God's creation. Second, God is not indictable for...
Which should sound a little bit like Hick and Irenaeus and the soul building idea. So there's a little bit of overlap they have there.
Genuine evil, because again, that genuine evil is a necessary risk of the kind of world that can overcome triviality. This world of complexity and beauty and creativity and self.
Actually, no, so it's worth pointing out too, the reason they have to argue this way is because the obvious logical alternative is the one that Schopenhauer famously articulated, that it would be better if there were nothing, because there's too much suffering. So if sort of looking at the world, what you observe is there's way too much suffering, therefore it would be better if the world didn't exist, then you need to have some reason why would God go to the trouble of creating the world if that's what the world is producing. So so process still has to have sort of some element of something that looks like the soul building answer, because they need to have an answer of why would God do this at all if it comes with this consequence.
Determination. But God is also not indictable, because when genuine evils occur, God cannot coercively act upon the world to prevent them or to stop them once they've begun. Now, this claim leads to our next categorizing question. Can God prevent evil? Again, for process theologians, the answer is a resounding no, if by prevent we mean coercively prevent. God is everywhere at work in the world, attempting to lure creation toward initial aims that do not cohere with genuine evil. They might cohere with discord in as much as that's necessary to overcome triviality, but they're not genuine evils. God is trying, by way of non-coercive influence, to avoid these kinds of evils, but God cannot coercively prevent them. So we have a God who is responsible for evil, but not indictable for evil, and a God who cannot prevent evils from occurring or from persisting. This idea leads very nicely into our three diagnostic questions. First, what is the origin of evil? Again, for Cobb and Griffin, God lures the world toward an order in which overcoming triviality is possible. This order entails the inevitability and necessity of discord, and it also risks the existence of genuine evil. Evil then originates because it's part of the order that God created, which is necessary to achieve the goals God wants to achieve, or because creatures in their own self-determination have brought about genuine evil. Why then does evil persist? Again, evil persists because God is unable to coercively prevent it. Once God lures the world into existence, God loses control. The world takes on a life of its own. God cannot dictate where the world's going to go next, and God cannot simply will it out of existence. God must work with what the world provides God, but God cannot work with it coercively. Therefore, again, God cannot stop evils from persisting. One more point is important to note with the persistence of evil. While God is unable to coercively stop the persistence of evil, God also continues to lure the world toward discord, inasmuch as that is inevitable or necessary to God's project of overcoming triviality. God lures the world toward pain and suffering, these inevitable or necessary features of the world. Cobb captures this idea well when he suggests that in the act of predation, God is actually luring the prey to run away from the predator, but God is luring the predator to hunt and kill the prey. God is luring both in this direction because that is conducive with each creature's nature. That's the initial aim that would be their enjoyment. The prey getting away and living another day, and the predator killing the prey and eating it. It's important to note then that God lures the world in a direction in which individual creatures must lose. Either the prey is going to get away, in which the predator will go hungry, or the predator will kill the prey, in which the prey will suffer and die. The third diagnostic question is probably the one that process theology struggles the most with. Will God eliminate evil? Again, on the one hand, process theologians maintain that God is everywhere and at all times present in creation, luring the world toward goodness, or at least luring the world toward overall goodness, not necessarily the good of each individual creature. And God's lure can lead the world in new directions of beautiful creativity and heightened levels of enjoyment. On the other hand, we have to note that God cannot coercively impact the world. We also have to remember that God can only work with the world that creatures co-create. This world that we live in has had genocides, terrible natural disasters, pandemics, extinctions, so on and so forth. That's the world God has to work with, and God cannot coercively control that world. That means that God cannot guarantee the future that God desires for the world. In other words, God might lose. God might never see the future that God ultimately wants to see. Cobb and Griffin acknowledge this point, that God can't guarantee victory over evil, but they also say that God will continuously work toward victory over evil. But we have to ask then, how likely is that victory, given the limitations that appear to be intrinsic to God's very existence? Let's shift now.
Okay, we're about to run out of time.
Interesting.
So, whoops, come on, stop. There we go. All right, so any last thoughts?
I find it very interesting, and I'm not actually against it. I find that it's almost like a therapy. So I think I'll look further into it. Maybe I need therapy. Well, it is not a bad explanation. It's a rather hopeful explanation, or a realistic, because we could all be blown up tomorrow.
Right.
So I have a question about Whitehead. Like, so Whitehead turned to theology, or it was there all along, and then Cobb and Griffin took up Whitehead's idea. I mean, in a way, why is the theodicy aspect needed at all? If it's so based in the physics, was it Whitehead himself who brought in the theism context?
Okay, so yeah, there are kind of two major schools of thought in process. One that is kind of the Whitehead consistent version, and the other one is the version that Hartshorne introduced. This guy Charles Hartshorne is an American philosopher, lived in Texas. The Whitehead's own work can be read as a bit agnostic on the question about whether there is a God in the system that Whitehead is himself describing. So at that level, Whitehead is really better thought of as a philosopher who's interacting with physics, and he's come up with this interesting system. Griffin has come along and said, okay, I like what you're doing, and I see how I can use that to introduce theological constructs. Hartshorne comes in and says, yeah, and maybe there's some couple tweaks I can make along the way to make this a little more coherent with Christian theology.
Okay.
So Hartshorne sounds much more traditional when in his kind of presentation of these ideas, where Griffin sounds very scientific, sounds a lot more like a physicist when he talks about these things.
Okay. Okay. All right.
But for Whitehead, Whitehead personally, I'm actually not entirely confident I can tell you the answer, what he thought, because he seems
okay, because that book was so thick.
Yeah. Yeah, for Whitehead, it's very much it's more about the cosmology. Whitehead wants to describe reality.
Yeah.
Here is, I've been studying physics for a long time and higher math, and here's what I've come up with. Here's how reality works. It just happens to have, because of the way he talks about the subjective piece in there, you've opened it into a realm for idealist philosophy, right? So because idealist philosophy likes to emphasize consciousness controlling things and ideas, and that then is the opening for theism.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful, because I wondered how that thread happened. Okay.
Well, just in terms of cosmology then, though, if this process means that humans with their degree of self-determinism are fairly far, along compared to a rock or a whatever insect, then if the earth perishes somehow, or in other parts of the cosmos, this process is happening at a different level, it seems like. Maybe they are farther behind, if you want to call it that way, and haven't gotten that far yet. And we might have to start over here on Earth if there's nuclear war and all the higher level pursuit of, these good feelings is no longer possible in the same degree.
But they've also, what Whitehead's brought along with him is a way too that it's clearly not all about Earth and humans, because God has an entire universe.
Yeah, but
so that introduces a little more humility in that other constructions don't necessarily have, because they're so human supremacist in a certain sense. But for process, it's not important actually that there are humans persisting, right, except as an accident that God got lucky.
I get that, yeah. Sounds a little bit also like when it says God, when he says God is in process, like artificial intelligence, like say in a chess play, and as people are playing, that AI gains more information and more
So God has learned a lot about
I
humans
learned a
over
lot.
the years. All righty. Well, thank you all very much. I think
Well,
that worked
thank
pretty
you.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you.